Also, I would add to that, I mean, the cliched observation, but a grain of stereotypes always have a grain of truth. Picasso was Spanish, and there's a Spanishness to Picasso's art, which is not there in Matisse's work. And often critics polarized this and made Matisse the paradigmatic embodiment of French harmony, lucidity, etc., whereas Picasso was the extremist, the foreigner who dealt in tragedy and passion in a more grotesque fashion. But there is some element that Picasso links back to Goya, links back to a Spanish tradition of more dark and light drama.
Yeah, and I think also in that contrast, we have to remember that Matisse's France is not the France of Descartes. Yeah. There's a bit of it in it, but you know, Matisse is from the very north. I mean, he was born nearer to Brussels than to Paris. Right. And in what would have, I mean, in the 17th century, he would have been a Flemish painter, not a French painter.
Yeah, I don't think, did he come to Paris when he was about 20 or 19 or 20?
Yeah, you know, so I mean, he's really a person of the far north.
Did they look at faces differently, how they painted faces, or not?
I think you only have to look at the group of portraits that we put together to see how differently they conceive, for example, the very similar subject of the mask, and the mask as a surrogate for the face. They both, at a certain moment, begin to think of painting faces like masks, but they take very different ideas of what the mask means psychologically and in the way it's manipulated in presenting the face. I think that, you know, Picasso often is splitting faces, wrenching one half for the other, doubling eyes on the other side of the face in a way that Matisse wouldn't.
They knew each other 1905, 1906, met through the Gertrude Stein and her family. They exchanged paintings.
Yep.
What did they exchange, John?
I mean, very soon after they met, they exchanged paintings. And how they did this is still something of a mystery. And there's been a lot of controversy about why they choose particular
that was what I'm getting at.
Yeah. And Picasso chose, or was offered, a small portrait, very childlike, of Matisse's daughter Marguerite. It's been said that he chose it because he thought it was terrible, and certainly the people around Picasso encouraged that belief. And there's stories that they threw darts at it in the studio. There aren't any dart holes on the painting, of course. Matisse chose a very rough still life by Picasso. And, you know, again, thinking of what Kirk was saying earlier about the roughness versus of Matisse generally, and the more refined qualities of Picasso, it is interesting that Matisse chooses a Picasso which has some of the quality of his own painting, and Picasso chooses a very simplified portrait which reminds one of the simplification in his own paintings of the period. And we've hung them in the exhibition next to self-portraits of 1906 by the two artists. And I think if you look at these, you think, well, actually, the Picasso self-portrait has quite a bit in common with the Matisse that he chose for its simplification. And similarly, the Matisse self-portrait has quite a lot in common with the self-portrait by Picasso he chose for its crudity.
I want to come back to how you chose to begin with the portraits and what you chose to end with and the influence of the cutouts on Picasso's sculpture and all of that. But let me just stay with this notion. How much did they see each other? I mean, they weren't fast friends. They were different personalities, different temperaments, different ages, different styles.
Yeah. There were certain periods when they saw a lot of each other.
In Paris.
In Paris. And interestingly, if you think of the two great political events of their lifetime are two world wars. And both of these things were things that brought them together. During World War I, Picasso was in Paris not fighting, of course, because of being Spanish. Matisse had volunteered but wasn't accepted. So they are together. Many of their friends are not. That particularly brought them together. They went horse riding together. Yeah. In the time of the Second World War, when Matisse, in fact, was about to leave the country, he ran into Picasso. And coincidentally, the Germans are invading France. And Picasso says to Matisse, oh, it's the same idiots who ran the École des Beaux-Arts. And they effectively made a pact that they wouldn't leave the country. And in the years after World War II, they became close. And part of the reason is that they had this great fellow feeling during these periods of wartime.
Okay, but part of the reason was geography, too. And I mean, during the war, Matisse leaves, Picasso stays in Paris, and they don't see each other during the war.
Matisse goes to the south of France, which is where he normally lives, and Picasso's in Paris. But in fact, Matisse writes him, asks Picasso to look out after his paintings that are stored in a bank vault. They're in close communication by letter during the war. And then after the war, Picasso begins to spend much more time in the south of France, and that's when they begin to see each other on a very regular basis from the late 40s through to
Is the relationship much better then? I mean, have they come to settle into a kind of friendship or not?
Yes, there's still the same sense of suspicion.
Competition?
Yeah, competition
Suspicion?
and suspicion. There was one of the few earlier Matisse Picasso exhibitions that happened was one that happened in London just after the war. And in the research for this exhibition, turned up this wonderful letter from Matisse, who's worried about this and saying, you know, I think I'm going to be showing with an epileptic. You know, he thinks that, you know, people are going to think that Picasso's crazy, and why is he showing with this person, you know? And, you know, there's...
And what was the response to that exhibition in '47?
I think that a lot of people, I mean, this was England, I can say this because I come from England. You know, England in the period after the war was, you know, hardly sympathetic towards modern art. And I think people, in fact, thought both of them were mad.
Matisse wrote a letter to Gertrude Stein, critical of Picasso and saying he's a bandit. I don't want to see him.
Many artists said Picasso was a bandit. Picasso was such a quick study. You know, he could seize something and get to the heart of it in a minute. And often, I think it was Giacometti who said, he doesn't look at my studio with two eyes, he looks with two cameras. I don't want to let him in the door. There was many an artist who felt that whatever they were doing, they'd see on Picasso's easel the next day, that he was a very quick magpie to pick things up. But the converse is also true, that Picasso moved through things so fast that he touched on things for a month or a week that for other artists they could mine for a career. So he gave back quite as much as he took, I think.
Do you think they realized, both of them, their greatness, and that they were defining art?
Absolutely.
No doubt about it.
I mean, now think of it, it may seem to be an extraordinary egotism or an extraordinary self-knowledge, you know. And I mean, you know, it was clear that they were defining art from 1906 through to mid-century. The first half of the 20th century is dominated by these two artists more than any others. Current spin off them, you know, one can certainly argue very plausibly, and both Kirk and I would argue for the greatness of Mondrian, of Malevich, of Miro, and so on and so forth. But in a way, these two are the fountainhead of it all. And they knew it. And towards the end of their life, they talk about the great chain of art. And the artists they had admired, and they see themselves in this chain. And they say, you know, when one of us dies, a link in the chain is gone. And it's Picasso who says, I think, you know, if you die, I'll have nobody to talk to.
Exactly. And he also said, Picasso said, to grasp 20th century art, you ought to see side by side everything Matisse and I were doing. Talking about comparisons and similarities and influences. Matisse cutouts influenced Picasso's sculpture later. How?
Well, Matisse at the end of his life, because he was bedridden, could no longer draw from the model as easily, invented a new way of making art, which was with scissors and large pieces of paper that he had his assistants color. And in some ways, he went towards Picasso's way of making art in the sense that he thought about reducing the body to what he called a sign. That is, instead of drawing from the living model, to begin to produce these abstractions of dancing figures, acrobatic figures, which were condensed memories of the elasticity, the athleticism of the bodies that he'd studied all of his life. So he began working more from the imagination, and in this combination, almost like sculpting and drawing at the same time, cutting out these figures. He produced anatomies which in some sense recall some of the more surrealist anatomies that Picasso was making already in the 30s. But he produced them in a way that produced a dialogue between positive and negative shape and an authority of simple line that had a profound impact on Picasso when he saw them visiting Matisse at that time. And if you look at the cutout metal sculptures that Picasso did some years later, which in some sense are like origami done with sheet metal, you'll see that the idea of positive negative shape and of cutting with tin snips looks back to the same kind of technique and the same sense of form that you find in the Matisse cutouts.
Now, what was it exactly that Picasso began doing after 1954 to honor Matisse?
There are several different things. I think Matisse had always had certain signature themes, and one of them was the studio.
Right.
And the empty studio, and especially in his later life, in the 40s, when he was bedridden, he painted the rooms that he lived in as a kind of combination of living environment and studio. And Picasso did, almost immediately after Matisse died, a series of empty studios in the South, which are very much like Matisse's pictures of the 40s, with palm trees outdoors, art inside. They look like they're directly based on the Matisse's. As John mentioned earlier, he began a dialogue with Delacroix's Women of Algiers, and when Roland Penrose said, you know, these paintings after Delacroix look a lot like Matisse, he said, yes, Matisse left me his odalisques and I'm carrying on his work. And that whole interest in Delacroix and North African exoticism, which had really been Matisse's terrain, was something Picasso picked up. I think everyone who talked to Picasso and everyone who knew him felt that he was profoundly affected by the loss of Matisse and that it continued to reverberate in his art, not only in the first years after the death, but for years thereafter.
Why didn't he go to his funeral?
Picasso hated the idea of death. Why did he never make a will? He never signed a will. He left the most complicated estate you can imagine because of this.
He hated the idea of
He was
death.
superstitious. He was deeply superstitious. It's said that at a certain point in his life, he used to recite the names of all of his friends every morning so that nothing evil would happen to them. When the family went on a vacation, they had to put the suitcases in the middle of the room and do a certain number of circles around them so that the trip would be under good fortune. He was a very superstitious man, and as a Spaniard, haunted by superstitions of death. And he didn't want to admit it. He didn't want to sign his own will. He never wanted to think about it. And going to a funeral was exactly the kind of thing that would have spooked him. He wouldn't have liked doing.
Yeah, I mean, when the phone call was made to Picasso's house to say Matisse has died, he wouldn't come to the telephone. He didn't want to talk about it. It's recently become clear that one thing that he did do, or rather didn't do, was work. I mean, this was the person who was a compulsive worker, you know, who was working all the time. He was paralyzed by it. For 2 weeks, he couldn't do anything.
He couldn't work.
He couldn't work.
So the impact of his death was so
profound
that he couldn't pick up the
left him,
brush.
you know, artistically bereft, which was what was the most important thing to him.
What do you think was the single most important influence Matisse had on Picasso?
I think being Matisse was the most important thing.
Meaning?
That for Picasso as a young artist to have someone like Matisse there